Hello, so my name is Ian Cookson. I'm a PhD researcher at Manchester Metropolitan University. My PhD is in social identity and transport choice, and this is the first study of the three that constitute my PhD around thematic analysis of newspaper representations of cyclists. So we chose newspapers because they're a common method of communication, and we managed to find a complete corpus from which to work. Newspapers describe and create social reality. They have effects on their audiences, and also they perpetuate ideas of norms and beliefs, often to the detriment of marginalised groups, which is important in this context. Stephanie Freiberg's work on the representations of Native Americans in film and TV is informative here, as is the work by Chris Russell on representations of cyclists, which was in Australian newspapers. So I'm sure you all know the statistics around modal share, and that modal shift research is often interdisciplinary. From a psychological point of view, we're often concerned with motivations and attitudes, but from an individual perspective, or we conduct ethnographic studies of minority groups such as couriers. We also consider behaviour change, so predominantly the theory of planned behaviour, which is a staged behaviour change model, which includes attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioural control, and how they relate to an individual's attention to engage in particular behaviour. Again, this is from an individual perspective, and a couple of criticisms of that particular theory, in that habit might be a greater predictor, but also these antecedents and outcomes are often correlational, and there's no real description of the actual method of behaviour change. And there's very little from an intergroup perspective, so how people's group identities informs behaviours relating to transport choice. So the social identity approach that we consider here was developed in the 1970s by Tushfeld and Turner. It's actually two complementary theories: social identity theory, social categorization theory. And in this process, the categorization is a basic human process. We categorize everything we see, and particularly ourselves. We categorize ourselves into groups, say I'm more like you, or you're more like them. And this process then includes the internalization of values and norms of groups into social identities. We have many different social identities, which are all context dependent. And crucially, we compare our in-group, the groups that we belong to, with specific out-groups. We have a desire for our in-group to be positively valued. So for an example, our football team supporters, I support Preston, but I compare myself with Blackpool supporters. We have behaviours and actions that are derived from this desire for our positively valued in-group, and this can include stereotyping of out-groups, social creativity, which is around redefining the group values used for comparison, or social mobility, which is about joining a higher status group. So the methodology was mainly around trying to balance capturing all the representations of cyclists within a manageable data set given the resources. So I ran a series of pilot studies trying to establish the most relevant search terms and which newspaper titles to use, aiming to provide as wide-ranging a sample as possible. So from the pilot, articles were located within LexisNexis using the keywords listed here. From that population, articles were sampled through a constructed week sampling method. This involves selecting a random Monday or Tuesday, etc. from different weeks to construct a whole week for each newspaper title. And this is done because newspapers have a non-normal distribution due to advertising requirements. Following the article selection, I conducted a thematic analysis along Braun and Clark's recommendations to deduce as many representations of people on bikes as possible in 2019. I won't dwell too much on the thematic analysis component, but it is a qualitative research methodology aiming to arrive at consistent and distinct themes in a data set. And these are the results. The results were 6 themes, 6 quite clear themes: the activist, criminal, cultural lives, healthy bodies, the outdoors person, and transporter. I'm just going to give you a little quote from a selected article to illustrate each theme. So the activist articles where cycling was central to the protagonist, raising awareness for their cause. It might be cycling or charity, as I was doing here. Or as I've seen in Manchester recently, World Naked Bike Day. Or I didn't see that one, but I was aware of it. Criminal, and the bicycle is linked to criminality, and if it's gangs of kids on bike or people conducting crime while on bikes or stealing bikes. Cultural lives is where articles where people on bikes are portrayed as having a culturally rich lifestyle. They might go on certain types of holidays, so visiting vineyards rather than package holidays. And the quote is from an article about the editor of Vogue in the Netherlands. The healthy bodies is probably the biggest theme, and this is where the use of the bike is linked to improved mental or physical health. The outdoors person was similar to activist. It's more socially aware, but it's more geared around having an active outdoor lifestyle. And the transporter was about the people that are commuting or transporting goods using a bicycle. So what does this all mean from an intergroup perspective? So I discuss this in terms of the journalist writing from the position of being a motorist, so being in the dominant high status group, in comparison with the lowest status or minority group of cyclists. And we can see this in a couple of ways. So firstly, there's this discursive strategy of othering or marginalising people on bikes, because they're presented as people who are slightly different in some way. They're all extreme examples in each case. They don't represent the majority of the population and therefore the dominant group. The journalists therefore are writing from the position of the majority group, i.e. they are motorists, and if they do consider themselves as cyclists, as with journalists such as Peter Walker or Helen Pidd, we would see more in-group representations and less marginalised and extreme examples. So while this isn't a quantitative piece of research, healthy bodies is quite clearly the largest theme, and the transporters is the smallest. And then again, this fits with this idea that the journalist is writing from an insider perspective inside the dominant motoring group. So using the gym or being healthy is something familiar to them. But we can infer that many wouldn't class themselves as cyclists, so the transporters is therefore a small theme. They identify less with that theme. But I also draw comparisons with Michael Billig's descriptions of banal nationalism in his book. Here he outlines how sort of hot nationalism, as depicted by the flag waving of right-wing groups, is only possible if you have a constant reminder of your own nationalism through currency, political rhetoric, or the media. So in line with Billig's conceptualization of nationalism, the bike here is portrayed against a backdrop of motoring. In this sense, people using bicycles are portrayed as unusual, while motoring is banal or pervasive. And there was a quote from the Telegraph where it says, people have to walk more, cycle more, meaning more cycle paths and pedestrian-friendly routes. So the use of the word people there is important. It suggests that they will need to cycle more to reduce climate change, but it implies that most people do not currently walk or cycle. So drawing together the kind of theory and the media representation shown here, we can't say for certain the effects they have on the audience, but we can see that journalists are writing from the motorist perspective as members of the high status group, therefore marginalising the cyclist, and we can surmise that motorists are less likely to want to join the minority cycling group if the representations are extreme. So a couple of things to consider. This was 2019, so this was pre-COVID, pre the pandemic. And we've seen a lot of changes in terms of discussions around active travel, pop-up cycle lanes, etc. So this could be replicated more recently to see if there's any changes in newspaper reporting. Plus, there's an ongoing and quite urgent need for a reduction in car use. So this might now change as a result of the recent discussions in climate policies. And my further studies are developing this, so they take these themes and conduct a discourse analysis of interviews with cyclists and other transport users in the second study, and the third study will be a phenomenological study of cyclists' lived experience. So I just want to thank you for your time. If anyone's got any questions, please contact me at the email address given. I'll be happy to discuss his work. Thank you.